morning, students. In today's class, we will continue with the story that we started yesterday. Just to make you remember what we started yesterday we started with the story A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner. I told you yesterday that the story is divided into 5 sections, and it is a little typical story, typical in the sense that it has a complicated storyline which moves back and forth into the past and present, plus it has a difficult vocabulary. Since we are not taking the entire text in the class, referring to vocabulary would be a problem, but anyhow I'll make you explain the story in general. So yesterday we began with the story and we discussed with the section 1 of the story. In section 1, when we begin the story, you are acquainted with the fact that Miss Emily Greason, the protagonist of the story, is already dead. So when she is dead, the funeral has to be organized, and the funeral is attended by men and women of that particular area in large numbers. As pointed out by the writer, men attend the funeral because of out of some respectful affection for the fallen monument, and women out of curiosity. Why out of curiosity? I explained yesterday also that as long as Miss Emily Greason was alive, nobody was allowed inside the house. She did not interact with anybody. She did not have a social circle. She did not have friends. Since nobody knew what was going on inside the house, so when Emily Greason dies, everybody is curious to know what the interiors of the house look like and how Emily Greason lived. So when we started the chapter, you are made acquainted with the fact that Emily Greason is dead, and then there is a referring episode of the taxes which Emily Greason had to pay, which she refused to pay, and despite all the notices served to her by the office, she does not respond to it. And when finally a committee of 2-3 members, they go to meet her to her place, they are gently rebuked by Miss Emily Greason, and Miss Emily Greason explains them in one single line that she owes no taxes in Jefferson. This is how we finish with section 1. Now when we begin with section 2, the writer continues the story further and he says that Miss Emily Greason's behavior was the same that she had demonstrated 30 years back when they had come to inquire about the smell. This episode begins after the death of her father. After her father died, she stopped coming out of her house. She did not contact anybody. She did not interact with anybody. Only a nigger, the servant who was supposed to take care of the family and to take care of Emily Greason, was seen moving in and out of the house. Then started coming a foul smell from the place, that is from the house of Miss Emily Greason. And when this was brought to the notice of the authorities, few people in the office said that how can you just tell a lady that she's smelling bad? But something had to be done about the smell that was coming from Miss Greason's house. And ultimately what was decided upon is that few people one fine night jumped into the house of Miss Emily Greason, and they were carrying the sack of limes, and they sprinkled limes everywhere. And this particular episode was all witnessed by Miss Emily Greason. To quote from the text, the writer says, as they recrossed the lawn, a window that had been dark was lighted, and Miss Emily sat in it, the light behind her and her upright torso motionless as that of an idol. They crept quietly across the lawn and into the shadow of the locust that lined the street. After a week or so, the smell went away. So, from this particular episode, we can just make out that what was the behavior of Miss Emily Greason and how people, though she did not contact anybody, though she was not talking to anybody, but people were damn afraid of her. And this episode, after the lime has been sprinkled into the house, the smell withers away after a week or so. But after this episode, the people of that particular locality, they start feeling sorry for Miss Emily Greason. They start feeling sorry for her because they realize that how lonely she can be. When her father died, the house was the only thing that was left to her, and the people were glad. And the writer narrates that when her father died, all the ladies, they prepared to call at her place to express the condolence. And when they reached to the house of Miss Emily Greason, they were all greeted by Miss Emily Greason. And Miss Emily Greason told them only one thing. And she told them that my father was not dead. And she kept on saying this particular line to all the people who used to come to her every day to offer her condolence. And she kept on doing this for 3 days. For 3 days, she did not accept the fact that her father is dead. She would not allow anybody to take away the body of the father, and only when the neighbors and the people of that particular locality insisted that the law would be enforced, only then did Emily Greason break down and she allowed her father to be buried quickly. And after this episode, people started feeling a little sympathy for her. They started realizing that how Emily Greason could be so lonely with father gone, who was the only one she had as a company, and no other social circle. This episode finishes the section 2 of the story. So in section 1, we are acquainted with the death of Emily and the tax episode that refers when she refuses very curtly to the officials that she doesn't owe any tax. The second section narrates the death of her father and how after her father's death, the entire community, the entire locality started feeling a little sympathy towards her. Now when the writer begins with the third section, he says that after the death of her father, Emily Greason was sick for a long time. Nobody saw her for long. And then something started in the town. And the work started in the town. And when the work started in the town, the construction company came along with niggers and machinery and mule. And the commander was Homer Barron. Homer Barron was a Yankee with he was a big, dark, ready man with big voice and eyes lighter than his face. Why Homer Barron is described in detail by the writer? Because Homer Barron is supposed to be the romantic angle in Emily Greason's life. So when the construction company comes, the leader Homer Barron comes. Homer Barron is a lively personality, as we come to know through the essay, that whenever there are bouts of laughter, whenever there are people laughing loudly, and if you perchance happen to peep into that company, you will find Homer Barron in the center of that particular thing. So as the story progresses, Homer Barron and Emily Greason, they start seeing each other. And when they start seeing each other, the talk of the town becomes that how can Emily Greason, who is so sophisticated, so aristocratic, could fall in love or could fall for a daily wage worker? How could she give up her noble qualities and a noble character for this particular man? And then, as usual, when the people said after the death of Miss Emily's father, poor Emily, when her affair started with Homer Barron, again people came out with the same thing, poor Emily. But this does not deter Emily Greason. She kept on moving with Homer Barron. She kept her head high enough, even when we believed that she was fallen. So the people of the town believed that Emily Greason had fallen because she had fallen in love with a man, or she was in company of a man who was beyond her dignity and her status. But Emily Greason did not let this come into her way. She was as proud of herself as she always was. Now in section 3, there is one particular episode which changes the complete format of the section 3. And in this particular section, Emily Greason goes to a medical store to purchase poison. And when the shopkeeper inquires as to why she requires the poison, she doesn't reply to it, but she says, I want the best of the rat poison. Now when Emily purchases that poison and the poison has been brought to her home, it again becomes the talk of the town. People start talking to each other because they are not able to guess the cause of Miss Emily Gleason's purchasing the poison. Everybody is speculating. Everybody is just talking about it as to what is going on between Homer Barron and Miss Emily Gleason. Is something wrong between them? Now, what happens after that? Is Miss Emily Gleason consuming the poison, or is the poison for Homer Barron, or is it really for rats? This is a question that is put in by the writer in section 4 and section 5 of the story. So till here we have covered 3 episodes of the story: the death of Emily Gleason, the death of her father, and the entry of another important character in the story, Mr. Homer Barron, who is supposed to be the company that Emily Gleason indulges into after the death of her father. But to leave the students in suspense, does the story finish with a happy ending of Emily Gleason marrying Homer Barron? Or does the story end on a tragic note where Homer Barron deserts Emily Gleason and she's left all alone? The remaining 2 sections will be discussed in the further classes. So students, go through the story if you have the text of the story with you. Otherwise, once we finish with the story, I'll give you the summary and the important words that are to be taken for discussion regarding the story. So this much for the class today. Thank you all.